Hello A2, welcome to the psychodynamic approach, which is one of the first approaches that you will look at in the second year, and it follows on from the other approaches. So if you have a look on the specification, the things that you need to know, so this is the exact wording, the headings are the exact wording from the specification, so you could be asked a question like describe the role of the unconscious. The three things within the unconscious that we're going to talk about is the conscious, the pre-conscious and the unconscious. You might be asked to describe or discuss or consider the structure of personality. You've got the id, the ego and the superego, which you need to know about, and defense mechanisms, and then these three defense mechanisms are named specifically on the specification. You need to be able to, you could be asked to describe repression, denial and displacement. So those ones are specifically named, and you need to know about the psychosexual stages. So that should give you an idea of what you do and don't need to know. I will give you a little bit of additional background detail that's really useful for you to be aware of, but those headings are the exact wording of the spec and therefore the exact questions that you could be asked about. Additional knowledge obviously is always beneficial, but this the precise questions will be those, or a broader one, discuss the psychodynamic approach. So, the belief, psychodynamic approach was developed by Freud, very, very famous. The belief is that all human behaviours are motivated or controlled, developed, influenced by unconscious motives, desires and conflicts. So we are not aware what controls our behaviour according to Freud. We just act the way that we do from these unconscious motives that we're not aware of. The huge focus of the psychodynamic approach is early childhood experiences and how they develop human personality, and also how they explain human psychopathology, so where mental health needs come from. And the most significant thing about this one, it was one of the first unified theories. And hopefully what you notice, or what I'd really like you to look out for in this video, is all of the links that run together. So kind of the unconscious links in with the with personality, with the structure of personality, but then the structure of personality links with psychodynamic stages. Everything is combined together, so it's all an interweaving web. And this was the first kind of approach of its time that really allowed for that unified, that making links between all of it. It wasn't just step, 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 step. Every single step, every single thing could be mapped and joined together, and that was really, really significant. Okay, so we have the unconscious. Freud believed, and he used the analogy of the iceberg quite a lot, and it's possibly something you're familiar with, the very small tip of the iceberg is our conscious activity. So the tiny bit of mental activity we are aware of. So there's loads going on underneath. Think about another analogy would be the duck, looking very serene on top, and then paddling like mad with its legs underneath the water that we can't see. So the conscious is a very small amount of it that we're aware of, thoughts, perceptions, understandings. Then we have the pre-conscious, the things, and this is where kind of like the gap between the conscious and the unconscious. So if we really, really wanted to, we could try and access things from the unconscious through the pre-conscious. So there's a few things that we can become aware of. So stored knowledge, going back, reflecting on memories, those kind of things. And then there's the unconscious, and these are things that we are not aware of and cannot become aware of. So we can drag certain things from the unconscious into the pre-conscious, but mostly the unconscious we cannot be aware of it. You can see a huge list of things there: fears, unacceptable sexual desires, violent motives, irrational wishes. So a huge amount of the unconscious, and a lot of the things that Freud talks about happen in the unconscious. Techniques to access the information in the pre-conscious. We've got hypnosis, so these aren't ones you need to know about, but they are useful for you to be aware of, and I think most of you probably have some awareness of these terms anyway. So hypnosis is a state of human consciousness involved focused attention and reduced peripheral awareness. So and you're very, very open to suggestibility there, which is quite dangerous as we're aware now, but at the time was very useful. So the idea with the suggestibility was they'd guide us to share information and access information we wouldn't necessarily be able to on our own, but because we're being told to or guided to, then we can. So there's hypnosis, free associations. I'm sure you've done association games where someone says a word, you have to say the first word that comes into your head, moving around the room or bouncing backwards and forwards. Free association is similar, where you just talk about whatever comes into your mind. So the psychologist will just say whatever it is, just talk about it, just say whatever comes into your mind, and then that is discussed and considered, because you're without thinking you're starting to access that pre-conscious. And there's also free writing as well, where you just write whatever you can think of. And then Freudian slips, so mistaken speech which reveals unconscious desires, so allows us to reveal all of those things we're unaware of, and we will look at those a little bit more in class because they're quite fun as well. So you don't have to be aware of these, you don't have to talk about them, but it's useful to know about them. Structure of personality you must know about is made up of the id, the ego and the superego. And as you can see, the id and the ego are very much in the unconscious, and the ego is very much in the pre-conscious. So a lot of personality is the id and the ego. A lot of our behaviour comes from internal conflict between the id and the superego, and the ego is trying to balance that. So a lot of that is in the unconscious. So Freud refers to the structure of personality as tripartite, and made up of three. So a nice fancy word that's quite simple that will show your knowledge. And we have the id. You're born a screaming ball of id at birth. That is the only thing that babies are made up of. The id is driven by the pleasure principle, so you want immediate gratification. That's why babies scream and cry the minute they get hungry, because they haven't learnt that kind of control. They haven't got the ego or the superego to control them. They scream because they must have whatever it is that they want immediately. And if we achieve the demands of the id, and this is at any age when we're an adult, because we do still experience drives of the id throughout our whole life, if we achieve the demands of the id, we get pleasure, and if we denied them, then we experience displeasure, tension, conflict, all of those things that motivate our behaviours. So if we might not understand why we're doing a behaviour, why we're acting a certain way, why we're feeling a certain way, it could be because the id is controlling us. And the id is the only part of personality that goes unchanged throughout the whole of our lives as adults. It's not and children. It's not influenced by experience. It doesn't develop and grow. It's always exactly as it is at birth. So the ego is the next thing to be developed within humans, and that's in the anal stage, which we'll look at in a little bit, so you can see how they're all starting to intermingle together. That's in the so it's in the unconscious, the ego, which we need to know about, and it's in the anal stage. It's part of the psychosexual stages. This mediates between the unrealistic id. The id isn't based in the real world, and the external real world, and that's why the ego works on reality principle. So it works on the reality of what is achievable, what is realistic, what we can do in the the real world, whereas the id doesn't care about the real world. It just wants what it wants. And the ego is all about decision making and rational thinking. And the idea with the ego is it devises a realistic strategy to obtain the pleasure. The id just wants it immediately, whereas the ego needs to think sensibly, create a strategy to get that pleasure. And Freud, this direct quote from Freud, the ego is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse. The suggestion is the id is really impulsive, really strong, and much stronger than a horse is, as strong as a horse in comparison to a man. So a man is physically much weaker than a horse, but the ego's job is to hold back the id, and the ego uses defense mechanisms to protect itself and protect the personality that it is part of, and we'll look at defense mechanisms in a moment. And then finally the superego, which is value takes in the values and morals of society. So you've got the id, which is immediate pleasure and gratification, the ego, which is the realistic strategy, and then the superego, which is values and morals from society, and that's developed in the phallic stage through the Oedipus complex. And it's based on the morality principle because it's based in morals, and it controls the id's impulses, and it tries to persuade the ego to more moralistic goals. So the ego is all about getting the id what it wants, but in a sensible kind of realistic way. The superego is all about trying to stop the ego from getting the id whatever it wants, and getting the personality to be more moralistic, to do more moralistic things. There are two bits of the superego: the conscience, which, and again, you don't have, these aren't named on the spec, but they're useful to be aware of. The conscience, which punishes the ego through causing feelings of guilt, and that's where the defense mechanisms of the ego come in. When the conscious is punishing the ego and makes it feel guilty, and the ego wants to protect itself, so use defense mechanisms. And the ideal self, which is an imaginary picture of how you ought to be, looks at what career you want, how you should treat other people, how you should behave as a member of society. So it's this perfect vision of who you should be. And just to give you an idea of how they work together. And if you think about the ego in the middle is the person in the middle, the devil on one shoulder is the id, and the superego is the angel on the other side. The id saying, I want it now, give it to me now. The ego is going, you can have it, but just need to do a little bit of planning first. And the superego is going, you can't have it, it's not right. So, for example, examples of the id, Sally was thirsty, and rather than waiting for a drink, she just took somebody's glass off somebody else's table. She just drank out of someone else's glass. So the id was thirsty, it drank. A hungry baby cries until it's fed, was the example used before. A toddler wanting another helping of dessert and just whines until they get another serving, or again just steals it, just takes it. There's no realistic kind of understanding of the reality, just takes what they want. Same here, somebody sees some money fall out of somebody's pocket and they just take it. Examples of the ego then, Sally is thirsty. However, she knows that the server will be back real soon, or Sally's really thirsty, the id wants to drink but the ego wants a realistic kind of plan, so it waves the server over and asks for a drink, and then it gets water in its glass to drink. Even though Michael needed money, he decides not to steal the cash because he doesn't want to get into trouble. So the id wants the money, and the ego is saying, not now because we don't want to get into trouble, or trying to think of a strategy. So the ego would still support the id to take the money, but it'd be trying to think of a realistic strategy of how it wouldn't get into trouble. So they would still steal the money if they thought they could get away with it. In the line at salad bar, Amy really wants to shove handfuls of croutons into her mouth. However, because her boss is there, she waits until she sits down to eat. So she still gets the croutons, but she just waits. A realistic strategy, she just waits a little bit longer. And then the superego. So the superego would be if Sally was thirsty and wanted to drink, the ego would make her want it. The id would make her want it. The ego would say, well, just wait for a minute and we'll get a drink. And the superego might say, well, you don't deserve a glass of water because you were rude to the server earlier on, so you don't deserve to ask them for it. Here, Sarah knew she could steal supplies from work and no one would know about it, so that would be, the id would want the supplies, the ego would plan it and go, that's fine, no one will catch us, but the superego goes, no, stealing is wrong, so she shouldn't take anything, even though she won't get caught. Maggie couldn't remember the answer to question 12, even though she'd studied, so she decides not to cheat. Her conscience stops her. Id wants to get the right thing on the test, so it avoids getting into trouble, that kind of stuff. The ego says, well, wait until nobody's looking and then have a look, we'll have a realistic plan. And the superego goes, no, that's wrong, you shouldn't do it at all. Okay. And then obviously opportunities for affair, same thing. The id would want to sleep straight away with the stereotypical businessman. So the id would straight away want to sleep with the beautiful woman in the bar. The ego would say, well, at least wait until, invite her back to the hotel room, at least wait till we're not in public. And the superego would say, no, it's wrong to be unfaithful to your wife or to your partner. Okay, so conscience from the superego makes the ego feel guilty. The ego uses defense mechanisms to protect itself, and these are called psychological strategies which are unconsciously used. We are not aware, we have no control over them, we can't choose whether we use them or not. They protect a person from anxiety and from unacceptable thoughts or feelings used by the ego, and when the id and the ego, superego, are too demanding, so again it protects itself. And if used too much, if they are relied on too much, they can become unhealthy and they can lead to mental health needs. So defense mechanisms are a healthy thing to use immediately to respond to kind of conflict and things that are challenging, but ultimately if you use these techniques for too long, then they develop into what Freud would call neuroses and considerable mental health needs. Repression was the first defense mechanism that was identified, and it's the unconscious blocking of unacceptable thoughts due to guilt from the superego, and it influences our behaviour without realising. So we don't understand why we're doing something, and that's the same for all defense mechanisms. We don't know why we're acting this way, but the ego and the defense mechanisms are influencing us. So the key thing here is unconscious blocking of unacceptable thoughts. So a child is abused by a parent, later on has no recollection of the events, they've repressed them, but has trouble forming relationships. This is my favourite for some reason. A person greets another with "pleased to beat you," so that's the idea that they're possibly repressing the idea of violence towards the other person. They didn't know they were violent, they've repressed it, they've gone, no, I'm not violent, don't acknowledge it, they block that unacceptable thought, and it comes out through a Freudian slip of pleased to beat you. A man having no recollection of an accident that he had, for example, you repress that memory, it's too difficult to deal with. And a woman having no recollection of intense pain she's gone through in childbirth, you've repressed those memories. To protect you, so it might allow someone to have another child, or it might allow you not to blame your child or dislike them because they caused you so much intense pain, according to Freud. Denial, refusing to accept reality, refusing to avoid to deal with it, so you don't have to deal with it. You act as if nothing's happened, and it's one that's used regularly in early childhood. So it's a defence mechanism adopted very early on. For example, someone with substance abuse issues, you regularly have the ideas of alcoholics being in denial, where they deny the fact they have a drink problem, they ignore it completely, they refuse to accept the reality of their drink problem. Another example would be a man hears his wife being killed, refuses to accept it, keeps setting the table for her, so refusing to avoid with reality, still continuing exactly before the horrible thing they're denying happened. A person having an affair does not think about pregnancy or sexually transmitted diseases, so denial. So somebody sleeping maybe with a sex worker who potentially hasn't, who isn't held, perhaps hasn't been tested, or having unprotected sex with them, or having unprotected sex with anybody, I suppose. They're denying the fact that there could even be the possibility of sexually transmitted diseases or pregnancy. Not going to happen. Just continuing as they are. Displacement, and there's some nice pictures here. I'm sure you're all familiar with this one. Redirection of an impulse, usually aggression, onto a powerless substitute target, and it's usually a symbolic substitute, so somebody who symbolises someone else. The best way to illustrate this is through examples. So the boss shouts at somebody. So the boss gets angry and shouts at me. I go home and shout at my wife. So I can't get cross with my boss because. Obviously lots of problems, it's not great to shout at your boss, not great to be cross with them. I go home, and because of that I find a powerless substitute target, a symbolic substitute for my boss, which is my wife, and I shout at her. She then gets cross, she can't shout back at me, so she goes to shout at the son, who then goes and kicks the dog. A man wins the lottery, he turns to the person next to him and gives the person a big kiss. So it's not always aggression. Aggression is the most common one, but it can be that. A boy is afraid of horses, and it turns out to be a displaced fear of his father. So he can't, he's displacing fear of his father because he can't deal with that onto horses. And that's a really famous case study called Little Hans, not to be confused with Little Albert. Little Hans, Hans. You don't need to know about him in great detail, but he is quite an interesting case study of Freud's, where he had a huge fear of horses. Freud and his father communicated through letter, and they worked out that was a fear of his father, which was linked to the Oedipus complex. So that was the ego using a defence mechanism to protect itself from the Oedipus complex, which I'll talk about in a minute. I want to speak in a meeting but cannot get a word in edgeways, so I scribble furiously instead because I'm really angry, so I can't shout and tell people to shut up and listen to me, so I pick a powerless substitute, which is writing something down. And a religious person who is sexually frustrated focus their attention on food, becoming a gourmet, or possibly doing lots of charity work, maybe, or things like that. Now, I was a little bit concerned that displacement and denial were very, very similar, so I asked the AQA to share their understanding of what it was. So this is AQA, specific email from AQA to their response. Repression is the act of forcing a distressing memory out of the conscious mind. Denial is refusing to acknowledge some aspect of reality. The example of repression would be an individual forgetting the trauma of their favourite pet dying. So that's more about forgetting, sort of repressing something in memory, whereas denial would be someone continuing to turn up to work even though they've been sacked. So continuing previously as they had, so not accepting reality. Okay. Psychosexual stages. Freud believed that personality developed through 5 stages. So this is personality, this is the id, the ego, and the superego, and Freud believed these were developed through psychosexual stages. So remember, all of this is linked together. Each stage marks a different conflict that you have to go through, and if any conflict is unresolved because something happens when you're a child or at whatever stage you're at, then the person will experience a fixation which manifests itself as unhealthy adult behaviour. So unresolved conflict leads to fixations, which is unhealthy, which leads to unhealthy behaviours there. Okay, so you do need to be able to explain what psychosexual stages are, and then these are the psychosexual stages, and wherever you can, and we will work on these in class, I need you to try and remember them. So you've got the oral stage, the anal stage, phallic stage, latent stage, and genital stage, and they are named by the area of the body which the child or the person is focused on, I suppose it would be a child, or not one, focused on where they are focused on the pleasure is coming from. So in the oral stage, the focus of pleasure is on the mouth. The mother's breast is the main source of pleasure. You've got to bear in mind at this time Freud was living in a time when very few people were able, bottle feeds didn't exist really. You'd have a wet nurse, so somebody else who provided milk. So obviously this is slightly outdated in that concept now, because a lot of people bottle feed, but the basic focus was pleasure from the mouth, food to the mouth. If for whatever reason something bad happened in that stage and you weren't able to move on from the conflict in the oral stage to the anal stage, then these are the kind of fixations you'd experience: smoking, biting nails, sarcastic, critical. You've got oral aggressive and oral receptive. They're two types of personalities. I'm going into a lot of detail here. The more you know, the better. However, the basics are key, and the most important thing is the ELECTRA and the OEDIPUS complex, which we'll come to in a moment. So, and then anal, 1 to 3 years. The focus of the pleasure is on the anus. So children gain pleasure from withholding or expelling feces, and I'm sure a lot of you know children at this age are obsessed with going to the toilet and poo and all of that kind of stuff. If you have some kind of unresolved conflict in this stage, then you develop fixations such as anal retentive, which I'm sure you've heard somebody be described as anal. So perfectionism, obsessiveness, lots of cleaning, and anal expulsive, so thoughtless and messy. And the kind of fixations, the kind of problems you might experience that would lead to a fixation would be things like being weaned too early, maybe in the oral stage, having something go wrong in toilet training in the anal stage. In the phallic stages, 3 to 5, the focus of the pleasure is on the genitals, and it's specifically called the phallic stage, focused on kind of phalluses or penis. And this is when the ELECTRA or OEDIPUS complex is experienced, and this is a specific one that you will need to know about, because one of the exam questions, and this leads to the development of the superego, and one of the exam questions I've seen come up is explain the development of the superego, so you need to know about this process so you can explain it. So the specific conflict that you need to be aware of for the phallic stage is the OEDIPUS or ELECTRA complex. If you resolve that effectively, you move on to the latent stage. If you don't, then you develop fixations which lead to phallic personality, so being narcissistic, reckless, and possibly homosexual. Which obviously is an issue with Freud, because he pathologizes homosexuality, implies that it's an unhealthy process in development, which of course is a very outdated view that very few people hold nowadays. So we'll talk about the ELECTRA complex now. I'll come back to those with friends. So this is all in the unconscious. Remember how these are all linked together. So this is in the unconscious, and this is a process that eventually helps to develop the superego. Boy develops a sexual desire for his mother, wants to kill his father so he can have his mother to himself. The boy worries that the father will find out and punish him by taking away the thing he loves. So at this point, don't forget, the focus is on the phallus, on the phallic stage. So he's worried about his penis. So the thing he most loves is his penis. Castration anxiety is developed. So castration anxiety is a worry that his father will chop off his penis. Following me so far? Makes perfect sense. The boy resolves the problem by copying the father and bonding with him. This is known as identification. So the boy is worried about castration, panics about castration. The way he resolves this problem is by copying the father, bonding with him, identifying with him, and this is known as identification, and the boy internalizes. So you want to know about identification and internalization, the male role model's moral values, and this is where the superego is developed. So boy fancies mother, wants to kill father, worries that he'll be punished with castration anxiety, so identifies with him and develops his moral compass, which is superego. And that's how Freud explained morals being passed through families. For example, why criminal behaviour passes through families. The boy identifies with the male role model whose superego is not as moral as it should be, so therefore the boy thinks it's morally okay to steal, for example. Or boy identifies with the father who is a very moral person, oh no, someone who gives to charity, philanthropist. Oh my goodness. Anyway, a person who gives to charity, so he internalizes that moral compass, and also gives to charity as well. And the ELECTRA complex, so this is the female version, and it's much less well formed, and it's one of the significant problems with Freud's. So initially a girl is attracted to her mother. When she discovers that she does not have a penis, she becomes attached to the father. She blames the mother for castrating her. She believes it's the mother's fault she doesn't have a penis, and she realigns her attraction to her father, explaining heterosexuality, so explaining why women are attracted to men, because she cannot have sex with her mother due to having no penis. The girl represses the hostile female competition, identifies with the mother because she worries she will lose her love. So the key thing here, and then a little while later the girl desires, has a baby to replace the absent penis. So Freud believed that children were a replacement penis, which is interesting, an interesting viewpoint. And of course then pathologizing any women who don't want children. So the key thing I would take away from this is the fact that he doesn't discuss the superego at any point. So it's less well formed, less well considered, and it doesn't explain why the superego is developed in women, suggesting that Freud potentially thinks that women are morally inferior. So that is what happens in the phallic stage. If that's resolved without any problems, the father doesn't disappear, the mother doesn't disappear, then you move into the latent stage, which is nothing really happens here. All the earlier conflicts that you experienced are repressed, so that is why you don't remember the Oedipus or the Electra complex. According to Freud, it all happened in the unconscious. And then the genital stage, which happens in puberty, where sexual desires become conscious alongside the onset of puberty. If there's any problems during puberty, then you develop difficulties forming heterosexual relationships. And Friends is a really good example of this. So Chandler is oral aggressive. He's very, very sarcastic. He smokes. Monica is anal retentive, very clean and perfectionist. Phoebe is anal expulsive, so messy and creative, so think how different they are. And then Rachel is oral receptive, so very, very reliant on others. And Freud would argue that all of those people, all of these characters, have had conflicts. So Chandler and Rachel would have had conflicts in the oral stage between 0 and 1 that weren't resolved, so developed in fixations. And Phoebe and Monica had things that happened that didn't allow them to resolve conflicts in the anal stage, so 1 to 3. So they developed fixations as well. So that is it. That's everything you need to know for the AO1. So it is a lot, but it all interlinks together and you'll remember it. We're going to move through the evaluation really quickly, so if you just make basic points on the evaluation, I am going to ask you to structure these in class, but we will go through them because I am aware that this video is quite a long one. Unfortunately, fortunately, unfortunately, the psychodynamic approach is a huge area, but hopefully it's quite interesting and a bit odd, so it'll stick in your memory. So, SPEC, I talked about it earlier in the year: supporting evidence, practical applications, evaluation of method, and contrast to alternative. These are 4 things that will help jog your memory for the evaluation points. You do only need 3, however, if you have 4, if you forget 1, you're fine. If you only remember 3, you forget 1 in the exam, you're stuck with 2. Supporting evidence. So Fisher and Greenberg conducted a meta-analysis on 2,500 studies of psychoanalysis and found the methodology used was scientifically sound. So it suggests that psychoanalysis is scientifically sound, the way it's researched is scientifically sound, and therefore the results that are collected are accurate, and they repeatedly found the same results supporting psychoanalysis. So have a think about validity and reliability and how they link, and we will look at those in a bit more detail. Practical applications. This is a huge area. Freud was revolutionary. He moved away from people believing all these unusual things about mental health, and you could possibly tell more than I know. Some of you know more than I do about this, but people should just be locked away in asylums. There was no way to cure them, support them. Some people still believed there was a religious basis, so it was demons possessing people. They believed that, although Freud still maintained this belief, but the idea that the womb detached and moved around the body, and that was what hysteria was. They still did trepanning. So there was very few treatments for mental health, and psychoanalysis was one of the first ones where Freud, the first talking therapies. So it was absolutely revolutionised the way, whilst some of his views are interesting now, it revolutionised the way that we as psychologists approach mental health. Evaluation of methodology, you have to be really careful, make sure you link it back to Freud, the theories, the approach. But he used a lot of case studies, Anna Rowe and Rat Boy, which you can have a really quick, and Little Hands. Have a really quick look at those if you want to. They are very interesting. The reason I'm not going to go into them in detail is because what I don't want you to do is get lost in the detail of the case study and not evaluate it. So have a think about case studies. What's the problem with them? There's only one sample. Can they be replicated? Can you check for reliability? Are they objective? Go back, use it as an opportunity to refresh your knowledge of case studies, which is a piece of research method that you need to be aware of for in A2. And then contrast to alternatives. So the idea of gender bias, particularly alpha bias. Freud very much held men up as the definition of normal behaviour, and women were abnormal. They were different. They were inferior. It was the way they behaved. So they had a really clear development of the Oedipus complex, explaining it quite clearly step by step. The fear of castration anxiety led him to the son to identify with the mother, developing a super ego, suggesting that men have a strong moral compass, whereas women are morally inferior because they don't go through the same process of castration anxiety and therefore cannot develop the same the same superego. So Freud doesn't explain women as well. He also has some awful views about women, such as the belief that wanting a career, being ambitious, not wanting a child, wanting a career, is that type of pathology, so a mental health, an illness in women as well, because women should want children to replace as a substitute penis, and to not have that is a mental health need, deviating from the norm. Okay. And then, of course, so that the fact that Freud runs throughout psychology and is the most famous psychologist, does that damage the reputation of psychology? Not considering all genders, does that impact on the effectiveness of his theories? He's not that interested in women. Do the treatments apply? Especially considering that it is mostly women who seek out, or a high percentage of people who seek out talking therapies are women, because they are more comfortable with that process of dealing with mental health. So think about the impacts of that. Brief notes on evaluations. We will recap and go through all of this in class, but I hope you've enjoyed one of our founding fathers of psychology and his very interesting views on human development.